The courtroom in Athens fell silent as the charge was read aloud. Impiety, Anaxagoras, the gravest accusation a citizen could face, the same charge that would one day kill Socrates. The accused was an older man, foreign-born, dressed simply, his eyes calm despite the murmurs rippling through the crowd. His name was Anaxagoras, and his crime was this: he had taught, openly and without apology, that the sun was not the god Helios riding a golden chariot, but an enormous glowing stone, larger than the entire region of the Peloponnese. To the jurors, this was not science. It was blasphemy. It threatened the gods themselves, and by extension, the city that worshipped them. As the accusers spoke, Anaxagoras did not tremble. He had spent his life following reason wherever it led, even when it led somewhere dangerous. What none of them yet knew was that this trial was never really about the sun at all. It was about power, fear, and a war being fought through him. Anaxagoras had not been born in Athens. He came from Clazomenae, a Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, where he inherited wealth and land but abandoned both to pursue philosophy. Legend says when asked why he did not care for his homeland, he pointed to the sky and said, "I care for that very much." He arrived in Athens as a young man, drawn by its growing reputation as a center of thought, and there he became something rare, a teacher to the most powerful man in the city, the statesman Pericles. For nearly 30 years, Anaxagoras lived in Athens studying the heavens, the elements, and the hidden order beneath appearances. He was among the first to explain eclipses correctly, to describe the moon as reflecting sunlight rather than glowing on its own, and to argue that natural events had natural causes, not divine tempers. This made him invaluable to Pericles, who valued reasoned counsel, but it also made him dangerous to men who feared philosophy loosening the grip of tradition on the people. At the center of Anaxagoras's philosophy was a single, radical idea. The cosmos was not ruled by capricious gods, but organized by nous, mind, a rational, ordering intelligence woven through all things. He taught that the universe began as an infinite mixture, everything blended into everything else, until mind set it spinning, separating light from dark, hot from cold, wet from dry, until the ordered world we see emerged. This was not atheism, not quite. Mind itself was something like a divine principle, but it was something far more dangerous to the priests and politicians of Athens than atheism. It was an explanation that made the traditional gods unnecessary for understanding nature. If eclipses could be predicted by geometry, if the sun was simply matter burning in the sky, then thunder was not Zeus's anger and plague was not a punishment. For a religious city that used the gods to explain misfortune and justify power, this was a quiet earthquake beneath their feet. Then, one afternoon, something happened that seemed to prove him right in the most dramatic way possible. Near the town of Aegispotami, in broad daylight, a massive stone fell from the sky. Ancient sources describe it as the size of a wagon, glowing, crashing to earth with a sound that terrified everyone who witnessed it. People flocked from across Greece to see the meteorite, and Anaxagoras, who had long argued that the sun itself was a burning stone, was suddenly vindicated in the eyes of many. If stones could fall from the heavens, then the heavens themselves were made of stone, not gods. His fame grew overnight. Students traveled to hear him speak. But fame is a double-edged blade in a city where the priesthood holds real power. The very theory that made him a celebrated thinker among philosophers made him a threat in the eyes of those who profited from divine mystery. And soon, his enemies would find a way to use his ideas against the one man who protected him. By this point, Pericles had ruled Athens for decades, and his enemies had grown tired of losing to him directly. So they turned to a different strategy, attacking the people closest to him. Aspasia, his companion, was accused of impiety and corrupting Athenian women. Phidias, the sculptor who built the great statue of Athena, was accused of stealing gold meant for the goddess. And Anaxagoras, his trusted teacher and friend, was accused of denying the gods entirely. This was not really about philosophy or religion. It was a political siege, one designed to wound Pericles by destroying everyone he loved and trusted, since he himself was too popular to attack directly. Anaxagoras understood this. He had watched Athenian politics for 30 years, but understanding the game does not protect you from its consequences. As the trial proceeded, the jurors were not weighing scientific evidence. They were weighing loyalty, fear, and the opportunity to strike at a powerful man through his oldest friend. The formal charge was Anaxagoras, impiety, specifically for teaching that the sun, worshipped by many as the god Helios, was in fact a lifeless, glowing rock. To modern ears this sounds almost comic, a man on trial for a chemistry lesson. But in Athens, religion and civic identity were inseparable. To deny that God's nature was to threaten the rituals, oaths, and social order that held the city together. The prosecution painted Anaxagoras as a corrupting foreign influence, a man who filled young Athenian minds with dangerous doubts. Some accounts suggest the trial carried the possibility of the death penalty, the same fate that would later befall Socrates on strikingly similar charges. Anaxagoras sat through the accusations with the same composure he brought to his study of the stars, neither pleading nor groveling, simply stating what he believed the evidence showed. He had spent his life observing that the universe operated by reason, not whim, and he was not about to abandon that conviction to save himself from a frightened crowd. Pericles intervened. Using every ounce of political capital he had built over decades, he spoke on his teacher's behalf, reminding the assembly of Anaxagoras's contributions and character. Ancient sources differ on exactly what happened next. Some say the death sentence was handed down and Pericles managed to secure a reduction. Others say Anaxagoras was quietly encouraged to leave the city before the vote could be finalized. What all sources agree on is the outcome. Anaxagoras did not die in Athens. He was exiled, forced to leave the city that had been his home for 3 decades, the city where he had taught the most powerful man in Greece, where he had mapped the heavens and questioned the gods openly. He packed what he could and departed for Lampsacus, a Greek city near the Hellespont, leaving behind students, friends, and a life's work built in the shadow of the Acropolis. For a man who had spent his life pursuing truth without fear, this was the cost, not death, but erasure from the city he had helped in life. What is remarkable is not that Anaxagoras was exiled. Many philosophers faced worse, but how he responded to loss when it came. Ancient writers preserve a striking anecdote from later in his life. When messengers arrived to tell him that his own son had died, Anaxagoras did not collapse in grief before the crowd, as was expected of a Greek father. Instead, he paused, absorbed the news, and simply said, "I knew that I had begotten a mortal." It was not coldness. It was the same clarity he brought to the stars applied now to his own heart, an unflinching acceptance that mortality was written into the nature of things from the very beginning, and that grief, however real, could not undo what reason had already understood. This philosophy did not make him numb. It made him steady. And it is perhaps the same steadiness that allowed him to walk out of Athens toward exile without bitterness eating him alive, carrying his ideas forward instead of clutching at what he had lost. In Lampsacus, something unexpected happened. Rather than fading into obscurity, Anaxagoras was welcomed. The city recognized the value of the exiled philosopher and gave him land, students, and the freedom to continue his work uninterrupted by Athenian politics. He founded a school there, and unlike in Athens, no one threatened him with death for explaining eclipses or describing the true nature of the sun. It is a quiet irony worth sitting with. The man condemned in the most sophisticated city in the Greek world found peace in a smaller one that simply let him think. He spent his remaining years teaching, writing, and refining his cosmology, untouched by the political storms that had consumed his life in Athens. His exile, meant as punishment, became instead the setting for some of his most productive years. Proof that sometimes what looks like an ending is simply a relocation of the work that matters. As Anaxagoras grew old in Lampsacus, the city's leaders came to him and asked what honor he wished to receive after his death. They expected him to request a statue, perhaps, or a grand public funeral befitting a man of his renown. Instead, Anaxagoras asked for something startlingly modest, that on the anniversary of his death each year, the schoolchildren of Lampsacus be given a holiday from their studies. That was his only wish. Not marron, not monuments, just a small annual freedom granted to the young, in memory of a man who had spent his whole life pursuing the freedom to think without fear. The city honored this request faithfully for generations after his death, and it is said the tradition continued long after most people had forgotten exactly why the holiday existed at all. There is something quietly profound in this choice, a philosopher who had been threatened with death for his ideas, choosing in the end not glory, but simply a gift of unstructured time for children to be free, if only for a day. When Anaxagoras finally died, the people of Lampsacus honored him further, erecting an altar dedicated to mind and truth, nous and aletheia, concepts that had defined his entire philosophy. It was a striking gesture, essentially building a shrine not to a god in the traditional sense, but to the very principle that had gotten him exiled from Athens, the idea that a rational ordering intelligence, not capricious deities, governed the universe, and that pursuing truth about that order was itself a sacred act. In this small city on the edge of the Greek world, The ideas that had once been condemned as impious were now literally enshrined in stone. It is a quiet vindication, centuries before science and religion would formally divide their territories, that a community chose to honor reason itself as worthy of reverence. Anaxagoras never lived to see his ideas fully accepted, but he lived long enough to see them protected, taught, and even worshipped in the place that finally gave him room to think freely. Looking back across the centuries, the trial of Anaxagoras reveals something that has repeated again and again throughout history. The persecution of an idea is rarely only about the idea itself. His accusers were not truly terrified of a rock in the sky. They were terrified of what that rock implied, that the universe could be understood through observation and reason rather than myth and authority, and that understanding it this way did not require permission from priests or politicians. This is the same current that would later flow through Galileo facing the Inquisition, through Bruno burned for cosmic infinity, through every thinker since who has had to weigh personal safety against intellectual honesty. Anaxagoras chose honesty, paid the price of exile, and still found a way to keep working, teaching, and living according to what he believed was true. His life asks a question that remains sharp today. What do we do when the evidence in front of us contradicts the comfortable story everyone around us insists on believing? You do not need to face a courtroom or exile to apply what Anaxagoras understood. Somewhere in your life right now, there is likely a belief you hold not because the evidence supports it, but because questioning it feels socially costly. A comfortable story about your work, your relationships, or yourself that you have never actually examined closely. Anaxagoras' method was simple and available to anyone. Look directly at what is actually happening, separate observation from inherited assumption, and follow that observation even when it is inconvenient. Today, choose one belief you have never questioned simply because everyone around you shares it, and spend 10 honest minutes asking whether it holds up under plain observation. You will not be put on trial for it. What you may discover, quietly and privately, the same kind of clarity that let an exiled philosopher watch a falling star and see not a punishment from the gods, but simply a stone, following laws that reason, patiently applied, could actually understand.